Hey guys, it's Debbie, and I am going to talk to Cara from NutriSense. And I've been so interested in sharing this information with you for months as a follow up to a podcast we recorded about a year ago on using a CGM, continuous glucose monitor, to figure out how different foods, real foods, nutrient dense foods, ideally, impact your glucose. And so we want to have that nice steady glucose level, say 70 to 80, 70 to 90, and also to see how food responds to our glucose or impacts our glucose 2 hours after we eat. And also looking at stress. As I always say, stress, chronic stress is a stress response. So if we feel like we are being attacked, we need to respond, react quickly, and get that, I can't speak, get away from that lion, tiger, bear. We are going to go as fast as we can and respond. And that would be a glucose response as well as cortisol. When cortisol goes up, glucose is going to go up. So we're going to talk about that. I also want to talk about how the athlete can use a CGM, NutriSense. There's levels. We talked there's different products out there, but what can you take? What information can you gain and apply it to your own fueling and training as we look at individualizing what we eat, when we eat, as well as stress, sleep, exercise, and more. So let's bring on Cara and dive in deep to continuous glucose monitors.
All right.
Oh, right. We've got Cara Collier from NutriSense coming on the show to dive in deep to your questions on how we, the athlete, endurance athlete, and those addicted to busyness can get good results from wearing a CGM. So thank you for coming on the show. We had you on about a year and a half ago, I think now. Been a while.
Yeah. Excited to be back. Always happy to chat with you, Debbie.
So kind of let's just dive in. What have you guys learned? When did you start NutriSense? It's now.
We started taking our first set of customers in September of 2019. So
wow.
2.5 years ago. Yeah.
Right before COVID.
Yes.
And so what have you learned the most from the last couple of years using NutriSense? Because it's grown a ton and everyone's talking about it on every show.
Yeah. I mean, we've learned a lot. From a business perspective, I could go on for hours.
Yeah, I bet.
But from a client perspective, and just to, I guess, catch anyone up to speed who isn't aware of kind of what we're doing or what a CGM is. So our mission and our goal at NutriSense is to help anybody discover and reach their health potential. So we really believe that health is a journey and it's personalized. Yeah. So we're trying to bring the right personalized data and the right human expertise to kind of marry that data plus human element in order to help people along with their health journey. So our customers are wide on the spectrum of what their health goals are. Some are high level performing athletes, and then some are maybe diabetic and really trying to navigate the waters of chronic conditions. So it varies quite a bit, but we utilize continuous glucose monitoring technology, or CGM, and a one-on-one dietitian support to kind of marry those two things. And we have learned a lot from all of the continuous glucose data that we have received. So, if anybody has dug into this world of CGM monitoring prior to kind of our launch as a company in 2019, there was essentially, little to no information about what are normal glucose patterns for a non-diabetic. Most of the research and application of this technology has been done on diabetics, which is a very important audience to be using this. But we really believed that everybody who has glucose could benefit from monitoring it. So we have learned a lot about just what are normal patterns, abnormal patterns, most consistently effective interventions. One thing that I think really stands out that we've learned is that everybody is a unique individual. We always talk about how there's no one size fits all approach, test, don't guess. And it is so true. How you and I are going to respond to a certain meal at a certain time of day is going to be totally different from each other, even though, we might look the same, be the same gender, both be physically active. It really varies quite a bit. And I think that is one of the most eye-opening experiences that I've personally witnessed through all of this data is just, I can tell you what the average response is or what successes we see with most people. But at the end of the day, your body is unique and you might have a different response than somebody else.
That's the main reason, I find I want every client to wear one because at least, 30 days, but 90 days is great because you can really learn what we talk about as nutritional therapy practitioners to eat real nutrient dense food that balances your blood sugar. As an FDN practitioner, we say test and not guess. So we investigate all these hidden internal stressors and external stressors, how it impacts the whole you from the inside out. So we need to have this information to know, okay, like you said, bioindividuality, what food impacts me is going to be different than you. But also, what I've learned a ton about when I wear one is how stress impacts me if I'm in traffic and, all these different things that we experience, external stressors, as well as those internal stressors while we sleep. And so much information. It's not just about what we eat, but so much more what I call the holistic method to really be fit and healthy from the inside out. We have to look at all these different elements. And this gives us such good data to really individualize what that personalized nutrition and health building protocol is going to look like for you as a unique individual. So it's necessary for sure.
Absolutely. And, a lot of people, when they think glucose, they think nutrition and they think carbohydrates, which is, of course, going to affect our glucose. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. But just like you said, it's so much more nuanced and in depth than that. It's the stress, the sleep, the physical activity, your environment. All of these factors are going to play a role in glucose. And that is super eye-opening for a lot of people as well, is just what are these different levers I can pull and which one might actually be my Achilles heel that I need to be paying more attention to. And I was neglecting, maybe it's the stress or the sleep or something else.
Yeah, because I want to kind of dive into each section of what I call the holistic method. But for me, it was just eye-opening on how I respond to stress, which go figure, I got adrenal exhaustion back in 2013. But obviously I see this now like, oh my gosh, no wonder. I wish I could see what it looked like 8 years ago, 10 years ago, because I probably respond to stress differently than other people. And my glucose would go up and I became insulin resistant from my lifestyle. I was doing low carb and fasting and all that stuff way back when, before it was a thing, and exercising all the time. But I got some insulin resistance without eating poor, sugary, high carb diet. So it's just great insight into what's going on for that person as myself. So let's kind of start with what is the optimal kind of circadian rhythm of our cortisol, melatonin. It kind of same thing. It kind of goes in sync with our glucose, how we wake up in the morning, the glucose is going to go up. And then if we can redo that for exercising, how that's going to impact what time of day we exercise and what is normal. Because people freak out when their glucose is high and they're measuring ketones, their ketones go down and they're just like paranoid about everything. So let's kind of clear up the confusion for the athlete perspective. So what is optimal and normal?
Yeah. So we'll start with just kind of a broad view of what to expect when you're looking at that CGM data. And then we'll kind of hone into kind of what to expect when you're looking at a response to maybe some different types of exercise. So when you're looking at your CGM data, as opposed to a finger prick where you're checking your glucose one point in time, you're getting a movie of your glucose data. So you're seeing what's happening 24/7, which adds a lot of new insight, but also can add potential confusion if you're not sure what you're looking for. So there's really two components into reading the CGM data. One is thinking about what's happening in a more fasted state, and then one is kind of analyzing what's happening when you're eating meals. So we can think about more fasted as in your first is your 24-hour average is one thing we want to take into account. So this is just overall, how was your average glucose for that day, or maybe for a time period of a week or 2 weeks. And we really want to see average glucose around 105 or lower. The other thing we can look at is when you're truly fasted. So, you can get a snapshot in time of your fasted glucose if you're taking a glucometer reading, but this, by seeing, kind of the CGM fasted data, helps you see more of those nuances. So while you're sleeping, what's happening? In the morning when you haven't eaten yet, what's happening? And in general, we want to see those fasted glucose values more between 70 to 90. But what is important to mention and point out is that while maybe you might want a fasted glucose of 70, 75, it's not always going to be statically at 70, 75. Our glucose fluctuates all day long, and that is totally normal. That means you have a healthy glucose homeostasis where your body's constantly kind of adjusting up, adjusting down. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, people will see their CGM data while they're sleeping. And normally we don't have any insight into our glucose while we're sleeping because we're sleeping. And they'll be really confused why it went up 10 points or down 10 points. And that's really quite normal. A small fluctuation between 70 to 100 while you're sleeping is quite normal. And for many people, we actually see glucose start to rise a little bit in the early morning hours. And this is what I call your body's natural alarm clock. So depending on your circadian rhythm, some are usually between 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. We see kind of a surge in glucose, where is a normal response to an increase in cortisol and other hormones that kind of help us wake up and get moving for the day. And then in a healthy metabolic system, we usually see that glucose come back down when you wake up and start moving around. And it's typically at its lowest at that time when you're kind of awake and moving. For somebody with insulin resistance, you see that surge in glucose and then it keeps going up and it has a hard time coming back down. But kind of seeing those morning fluctuations is totally normal. The other thing we really want to look at is what's happening when you eat a meal. And so for most intents and purposes, we're going to want to look at how high that glucose goes. What is the peak value? And we want to also see how quickly your glucose returns back down to normal. So that peak, most people, we really want to aim for under 140. However, if you're following a ketogenic diet or a very low carbohydrate diet, it would be very uncommon to see it go up to 140. Most likely it's not going to go above 120. So that would be kind of a more realistic target if you're including very minimal amount of carbohydrates. And then typically we want to see it kind of come back down to what it was before you started eating. About 2 to 3 hours after you ate, kind of see it come back down to those normal levels or at least around 100 or lower. So that kind of shows your body's ability to process that meal, kind of bring it back down to normal and be metabolically flexible, so to speak. So that's kind of a high level overview. Not sure if you had questions on that before I dig into the what to expect from a workout.
Well, for a couple questions that I just wrote down on people that want to know their ketones and, they can use, say, Keto Mojo and test their ketones, but are you able to correlate data with people using NutriSense and test like, all right, I'm doing my ketones. Is there any kind of patterns that you would see to know, okay, I'm probably in nutritional ketosis, as you said, that you're maybe keeping your glucose. Say I have a client that his numbers barely go over 100. He's just always just kind of steady, not any spikes. So would that be more that person's very fat adapted in nutritional ketosis, or is this kind of, you're assuming which each person's different?
Yeah. And so we do actually in our app, the NutriSense app, we have an integration with two of the more popular ketone monitors. So both Keto Mojo and BioSense. So if you're monitoring your ketones with either of those devices, it will automatically show up on your glucose graph in NutriSense, which is really helpful to kind of see that ratio. It's the glucose to ketone index is kind of a helpful way to paint a bigger picture of what's happening from a fuel standpoint and metabolically. So typically, if ketones are rising, we want to see glucose going down. So, if your ketones are 3, we don't want your glucose to also be 120. That would mean high energy availability on both ends. While if, your glucose is higher, and you might expect ketones to be a little bit lower. So typically they work in that sort of ratio, but if you're not measuring the ketones, I can't guarantee that if your glucose is 70 and it never goes above 100, that you're also in ketosis, but we can most likely guess that that's probably the case. But really the best way to truly know is to also track those ketones along with it. And then you should see them kind of move in opposite of each other.
True. Test and not guess once again. So with the insulin markers, are you able to, we can't ideally ideally we could see insulin at
Yeah.
the same time, but have you seen any patterns with that or done any research on insulin and the glucose levels?
Yeah, ideally a 24/7 continuous insulin monitor would be amazing. Unfortunately, that technology is not yet quite there. Measuring a hormone continuously is a lot more complicated than a metric like glucose. I'm hopeful that one day that technology will exist. But with that being said, there is a lot of data and research tracking people who are doing like a oral glucose tolerance test, and then they're tracking both insulin and glucose at the same time. And as a general proxy, when glucose rises, insulin also typically rises. We do certainly see research where insulin might be starting to rise at very, very early stages of insulin resistance prior to glucose getting very high. But that's usually kind of an early warning sign that glucose is about to also go up. So for most intents and purposes, they correlate fairly nicely, where if one is high, the other is most likely also high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing I was writing down to be fun to do a Dutch test and look at a 24-hour profile of your CGM NutriSense versus someone's cortisol and melatonin on a Dutch test, which is a 24-hour dried urine test. But just all these different biohacks that we can do to experiment to really see what's going on and get more clues. Okay. So with exercise, so if you're doing a low heart rate endurance workout, how do you see anything different in the glucose versus a high intensity, more anaerobic carb burning workout? Have you compared anything on that with your data?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're thinking about how glucose and exercise is related, there's two components to consider. One is what's happening to your glucose in the moment of that exercise. And then the other is how it affects your glucose kind of in the longer, bigger picture term. So in the moment, you can think about this as sort of supply and demand. So if we're doing something more steady state, low intensity, maybe you're doing a long run or kind of a longer bike ride, we typically see the glucose stay fairly flat and then go down a little bit. And sometimes if it's really long or it's slightly, getting a little bit higher intensity, we might see the glucose dip. And that's where with kind of our like ultra endurance athletes, you can kind of sometimes eventually see glucose dip and you kind of have that bonking effect. But typically in those like lower intensity exercise, we see glucose to be relatively steady or start to decline. Whereas in the opposite situation, so maybe something high intensity intervals or sprints, or if you're doing really heavy weightlifting, for that instance, we typically see glucose kind of spike in the moment. And that makes sense if you think about the supply and demand from the energy perspective. So if we're doing something intense, I'm about to sprint to that finish line, then my body needs energy fast and it needs glucose. So your body's going to create glucose and give it to it. And this is not a bad thing at all. So having a glucose spike during a high intensity moment of exercise is physiologically normal, right? What we don't want to happen is that our body needs that energy and we can't produce it, which means either we can't perform or our glucose goes low, and that can be really dangerous. So it's completely normal and healthy to have that glucose spike in those higher intensity moments. And it's very important to point out that this is not the same as a glucose spike from, a soda or a Twinkie. In those moments, your glucose is spiking, but there isn't any energy demand, right? Your body doesn't actually need that extra flood of glucose, and it's actually going to go through a different insulin pathway. So when we're drinking, soda or a juice or candy and our glucose spikes, we're going to have a bunch of insulin that follows along with it to try to deal with all that extra glucose. But when our body has a surge of glucose because we have an energy demand from exercise, a lot of that glucose uptake from the muscles is actually non-insulin mediated, meaning you don't need insulin in order to get that glucose where it needs to go. Because a lot of people are worried that if they have a glucose spike during, a HIIT workout, that it's either breaking a fast or it's causing insulin resistance. And that is not true. It's actually really helping insulin sensitivity and our overall glucose regulation. So that's kind of the longer picture view, is how exercise of all forms affects our glucose in the big picture. So whether it's the steady state cardio, whether it's the strength training or the HIIT, all of these things are very effective tools in giving us better insulin sensitivity, better metabolic health, and therefore better glucose control. So exercise is really quite possibly one of the most powerful tools we have in order to get good glucose control, get good insulin sensitivity, and avoid metabolic dysfunction. So always really important to point out that that spike during exercise is not a bad thing. Don't stop the exercise. Sometimes it can get really high, and that might be a sign that we're kind of under fueling. Maybe we need some food, a couple hours prior to the workout, or could also possibly be dehydration. So if we're seeing spikes above usually like 180 or 200 during that workout, that's when we dig a little deeper and try to just experiment with meals and hydration and electrolytes. But definitely doesn't mean that working out is ever bad.
Well, that's what I keep trying to explain it on this season of the podcast. Every episode on Tuesdays, I've been talking about fasting, carb timing, matching your fueling and exercise, and intuitive nutrition, intuitive training, that you have to really personalize it and listen to, all right, my body's saying this, or this is my workout intensity today. Here's my stressors. Here's my sleep data from last night, and looking at all these different metrics, but figuring out when to eat and not be afraid of some healthy sources of carbohydrates that people have gotten, to one extreme to the other, that now it's like keto. Oh, all carbs are bad for you. You're not a keto athlete. So, there's a lot of people like, you're not keto. And I hate all these labels because I don't even like saying a keto athlete, but just I'm hearing this information from people doing too low of carbohydrates, too much fasted exercise, and not really listening to the body and getting data from something as NutriSense, seeing when they could benefit from having a little bit of quality, healthy carbohydrates pre-workout. Sometimes for women, I'm hearing some information on that. And then also when to tap in, post-workout. But I think it's just such good information to know, okay, I'm doing a high intensity heart rate exercise. That's not a fat burning workout.
Yeah.
So think about how it's going to respond to using that muscle glycogen as fuel, and what are you going to do to replace that? Yes, you have gluconeogenesis, but I want to use up my protein. I want to break down my muscles and replace that. So I think it's teaching people, what to eat and not be afraid to have nutrient dense whole foods that might have some source of carbohydrates in them.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And, I'll be the first to acknowledge that as a society at a whole, I think we eat way too many carbohydrates.
Oh, yeah.
And being low carb and a ketogenic diet can be an amazing tool for many different use cases. But I also agree that carbohydrates can also have a lot of amazing use cases and can be a tool in the toolbox as well. So just because being low carb or ketogenic has helped, you in many different ways, doesn't mean that you can never incorporate that into your lifestyle. I agree. I see a lot of fear of carbohydrates, and particularly in athletes, you might be the person who has probably the higher carbohydrate tolerance than the person next to you who isn't very athletic or doing a lot of, performance or exercise. Because the more that we are training our muscles, the more that we are burning through energy, typically the more wiggle room we have for some carbohydrates in our diet without having a detrimental effect on our glucose regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a tool like this, I think, can really give people a lot of peace of mind, because you can experiment, approach it with curiosity, where it's a lot of times we're finding, the best benefits for those people who are trying to incorporate just a little bit of carbohydrates at the right time. Usually post-workout is the best time. Sometimes that pre-workout can help if you're having, those really big glucose spikes or you're feeling a lot of fatigue during your workout. But typically, if someone's trying to incorporate or experiment with carbohydrates, we start with that kind of post-exercise fueling. And, you can start with something small, start with a small portion size of something whole food, nutrient dense, and see how it goes for you. A lot of people are surprised. They're like, I thought it was going to be really bad. My glucose was going to go really high, but it was pretty steady. It was great. Or I tried this type of carbohydrate and it didn't work so well, but then I tried a different type and it worked really well. Same portion size, same overall composition, but just different type of carbohydrate. And they find that that's a great post-workout refueling strategy for them. So there is a lot of wiggle room for carbohydrates in an athlete's diet, even a low carb or ketogenic athlete's diet. And because you're so physically active, a lot of times, you'll still maintain higher levels of ketones the next morning, even if you're having a higher carbohydrate meal sometime in the day. Even from my own personal experience, I am not an athlete, but I am pretty physically active. I do a lot of, physical activity, definitely not at a athletic level, but I can eat close to 150 grams of carbohydrates in a day and still have a morning ketone level of around 1. And I didn't feel comfortable pushing it to that level when I was doing this type of experimenting until I could see, both the ketone and the glucose data, and saw that there's more wiggle room here than I might have anticipated.
Yeah, that's why I love what Rob Wolf has to say in his Wired to Eat, and do the carb tolerance test and using the CGM to kind of figure that out. And when we're definitely not high carb, but just that my point is, a lot of the guidelines out there for keto or low carb is 20 to 50 grams total carbs a day. And that's not really ideal for people that are working out every day, at least once. So I know I do coaching for Ben Greenfield now, and he says for athletes, does some research on 12 to 15 hours fasting overnight is enough. And then have your carb refeed, stay low carb during the day, carb refeed at nighttime works for him. And again, all the guidelines we tweak and individualize, but, looking at your life, your activity level, like my mornings, I did a speed run this morning at sunrise, and then I did a hard swim workout at lunchtime. So my meal post swimming was like 2:00. I'll have my main meal there and have a high protein meal. I'm not going to eat a steak before I go swimming. And in between that, so it's figuring out, what to eat. And it's being able to have, if, it's always a struggle to find what are actually any good carbs to eat that they're good out there. But I think it is just going back to customizing everything and testing, as Rob has in his book, a 7-day test to figure out what healthy real food sources of carbohydrates impact glucose. Now, I must say, and you can, we'll go into this, I was just at this natural food product show, Expo West, last weekend. And these foods that are called paleo or keto, they're certified keto. They're filled with monk fruit. Stevia is in everything. I couldn't find one product because I'm reactive to stevia. So my point is, there's a lot of foods that are labeled keto, but I think what I learned using NutriSense on my body is that these foods, if I have anything packaged, which I ideally avoid 99.9% of the time, but if I happen to have a bar or something that is keto, but it has all these fillers in it, and that will still raise my glucose. So I think it's learning how to eat real food, going back to nutritional therapy, eat real food that balances your blood sugar and not get sucked into this marketing campaign of paleo foods, keto foods out there that are filled with stuff that, even it's a keto sugar as erythritol, monk fruit, stevia, that can still spike your glucose, because it did to me. And if you found that with the sweeteners.
Yeah, I think that is a really great point to emphasize, where, food manufacturers and marketing companies, marketing departments, they are not thinking about your health at the end of the day. Just because they're slapping a, keto or paleo label on it doesn't mean that they're doing that usually with good intention of kind of the health outcome. Of course, there's always exceptions to that. But with that being said, you have to be really careful, especially with some of those kind of unknown ingredients or artificial sweeteners. They do impact people very differently. Again, bioindividuality. Some people see very little effect, both from a glucose perspective and a GI perspective, where some people really can't tolerate them at all. And as you're mentioning, it's usually best if you try to just, as a general rule of thumb, focus on more whole foods as much as possible. Because then you're not worrying kind of how, what is this mystery ingredient? How is it affecting me? But if you do have some favorite, bars or packaged foods, and you are using the CGM, that is a great time to try out those things and really see how it affects you. There's quite a few kind of common brands out there that may not be as keto or, glucose friendly as the marketing makes them out to be. And then there's even things, this is a personal example again, where Costco rotisserie chicken, it sounds like it's just chicken, but there's actually a lot of fillers and dextrose solution that they put on it that I didn't realize. And I was having a glucose spike from it. And I was trying to figure out what it was. And, again, it seems like it might be a whole food, but you really have to read the labels and be careful because, quite sneaky out there, the food manufacturers.
Yeah, it is for sure. That's why I always like to eat at home. Plus my husband's a good chef. So
that's very nice. Yeah, that helps.
So just another little kind of, I guess it was to be a biohack N=1 study, but just how we could possibly see a CGM with our performance levels, maybe a Garmin, looking at your workout data and tying that in to figure out when should I do a fasted workout and when should I eat something before or after? Because that's a whole dilemma. I think a lot of female athletes looking at their menstrual cycle, part 1, part 2 is just how their hormones are more imbalanced than a male, that sometimes we need a little bit of food before a workout. If it's just having a little bit of honey, or I've been experimenting just having a spoonful of bee pollen that has some calories in it. And saying it's okay now to have organic heavy cream in my coffee because it's some calories. But I wonder if there's a way to do your own little study to see, okay, does eating beforehand impact my workout in a positive or negative way? Or should I do it fasted and just wait till afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And this is where I really recommend, if you are going to try out the CGM, 90 days, like you mentioned, is a good amount of time where you can do plenty of experiments and really see what the best fit for you is. You can do it in probably closer to 30 days, but you're not going to be able to get the full spread of probably all the different things you want to test. But if you have a 90-day period, then you can try that. And what I usually recommend is starting with what you normally do. So maybe your regular routine is to do all your, early morning workouts completely fasted. And then maybe on the weekends, you do longer workouts and you have a meal before, whatever your normal routine is, do that and correlate both what your glucose data is doing. If you have any actual fitness trackers, like you were mentioning, a Garmin, Apple Watch, but also really important to also take into account your subjective experience. I feel like a lot of people kind of push that to the side sometimes. They're like, I want to do this fasted. And that's what I've just been doing. And then if you ask, well, how's that working for you? How do you feel? And you're like, kind of bad or kind of crappy. And it's like, okay, well, let's dig into that a little bit more. Or you might say, I feel amazing. It's important to kind of take into account how you're feeling, subjective experience. But then when you're looking at that glucose data, as I mentioned, if you're doing something kind of steady state, we might want to see that kind of stable, slightly decreased glucose value and pairing that with feeling fairly good. Whereas a lot of times we might see that glucose is stable and then all of a sudden it really drops off. That might be a clue that you might need a little bit of calories beforehand. And you could try kind of what you're saying. Maybe some heavy cream is enough, maybe some MCT oil, or maybe you need more of a mixed macro meal, or maybe you need something that's just simple carbohydrates like the honey or like a banana. And those are the different things you can kind of experiment with to both get your subjective experience feeling a little bit better and that glucose to be a little bit more even. It's very common that we see that kind of like drop off, and some pre-workout fuel helps that exponentially. And often it doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to be like you're mentioning a steak or like a, 600, 800 calorie meal. A little bit can do a lot. And that's where kind of the experimenting, trying something different each day can help a lot. The other thing that I was mentioning is sometimes we'll see, I was working with someone who's competitive tennis player, and they were seeing glucose spikes up to like 230, 240 while they were playing in the mornings, and it was in a fasted state. And so in order to kind of get that down a little bit, we just experimented with some really minor pre-workout fuel, and we're able to get that down to more like a 160 glucose spike. So pretty significant with just doing, actually, like you were saying, some honey was really what tended to help the most for that specific person. But really kind of seeing, is it spiking really high? Is it dropping really low? How are you feeling in combination to that? And then what can we tweak with both, pre-workout fuel, and maybe it's more so afterwards getting enough recovery and refueling. If you're having some carbohydrates after the meal, how's your glucose response? Sometimes we're overshooting it. Maybe we didn't need that much, or maybe we're underdoing it and our glucose is still dipping low, even though we just ate some food. And that's where, we pair you with a dietitian on our end as well, so that you can kind of have somebody to guide you through those experiments also.
Yeah. I have like 1,000 ideas that just like pop into my head, but I think it's, one I do a lot with Peter Defty, Optimal Fat Metabolism. He uses Vespa as part of one of his companies he's invested in. And I think it's the bee pollen and having that little bit of the bee propolis, and it has a little bit of orange juice in it, but it's just that right amount to get your body to burn fat. And so you can go longer, but I think it's just that whole N=1 experiment and this ongoing journey, looking at your back-to-back workouts and then, what you ate. I just shared with our Keto Endurance Facebook group page that, all right, I had more steak and a low carb dinner Friday night, but I did a long bike ride Saturday and I was doing a long run on Sunday. So am I going to have a fasted bike ride, not eat until later, or do I eat something? So it's always experimenting. And I made my own low carb keto protein scones that I put like a ton of stuff in and have that. But I feel that a lot of us, especially people are new at this. I've been doing this for 15 years. So I've gotten past this type A, I feel guilty if I eat anything or if I don't do zero carbs. And I think a lot of people that are newer in this area, they're, just keeping it so strict on having so much fat in their diet and not enough protein and not enough good quality carbs. And I think we just, punish ourselves and feel guilty if we do have anything to eat.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of athletes get stuck in that when they go into this fat adaptation process of an athlete and then figuring out, to eat or not to eat and keto and all of this. So it gets really confusing. But point is, I think using a CGM really can help figure that out. Like, oh, red flag right here. I went super high and I'm playing tennis fasted. Well, that's going to be more anaerobic. And maybe you need to have a little more carbs. And like Ben Greenfield tells us, he can do 200 to 300 grams of carbs and still stay in nutritional ketosis. So, that's depends on your self and your body and your activity muscle, as he is like all muscle. So I think it's really going back to experimenting, but I want to move on to stress and sleep, because we talked a little bit about stress, and my thing is all acute versus chronic stressors, and stress response can be, it's going to raise your glucose to respond to that threat. So have you found like anything we can learn from using a CGM? And I think it's, learning what your external stresses are and how to calm your glucose down with some breathing exercises or, meditating while you're driving your car or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of as we alluded to in the beginning of the conversation, that stress was really that eye-opening experience for you with the data. For a lot of people, I think it's the piece of the puzzle where they're like, wow, I did not realize the extent that my stress, the effect that my stress was having on my health and my glucose in particular. I think stress is something that is hard to quantify. It's a little bit more subjective. It's also something where if it's what your general go-to feeling is, it's hard to understand how that could feel different. Normal becomes normal. But in general, as you mentioned, our stress response, we can think of it as both acute and chronic, but in both instances, it's stimulating, a cortisol response, our stress hormone. And that cortisol response is going to basically initiate a glucose response. So it's either going to break down our glucose stores, or it's going to stimulate the body to create more glucose, all in the effect to give our body more energy to deal with the stressor at hand. So this is a evolutionarily normal adaptation where, if we have a stressor, we're at threat, something is trying to kill us, then we need some extra energy to deal with that. But, a lot of our modern day stressors, we don't actually need extra energy for. So many people will see, as they're sitting in traffic, as they're on a phone call at work, as they're replying to an angry client email, that their glucose is spiking. Or maybe it's at night, if there's family dynamics going on, they'll see that spike in glucose. And for many people, especially our low carb clients, that's the highest glucose of the day, is when they're having that kind of acute stressful moment. So it could be this really eye-opening, objective data, as opposed to kind of a subjective feeling that this is really having a true impact. And now I can see kind of how often that's occurring. So that's that acute moment. And that can be really helpful to kind of trigger and stimulate I need to find some supportive habits in order to kind of bring those stress down. Like you were mentioning, deep breathing, maybe kind of mindset changes. But the other thing that really accumulates, of course, is chronic stress. So often we see this kind of come up in those fasted and overnight glucose values. Mm-hmm. Typically, if we're seeing really high morning glucose values, high values all night long, and you're eating a healthy diet, you're not eating late at night, you're not eating a lot of carbohydrates, you're physically active, it's usually stress. It's that kind of chronic hum of cortisol in the background that's kind of bringing that chronic hum of glucose back up. And so that can be another really big indicator that you're kind of under this constant stress and need to really develop some stress management techniques to kind of get all of that back into balance and tell your body that things are okay, we're not under threat, and we don't have to constantly be stimulating this glucose response.
Yeah. And I was going to tie that into the next question. It's sleep. So stress impacts everything, and stress is going to impact sleep. But what I found, and I read on the Facebook group page for NutriSense, I see this question all the time with people having high glucose spikes in the middle of the night. And I found that to be similar for myself when I had something going on, internal hidden stressors, we say. And if it's like a pathogen, and in Chinese medicine, I looked it up, it's that liver time is between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. and seeing any correlation with that. But what have you learned with stress and sleep and glucose?
Yeah. So when it comes to sleep, like you're mentioning, if you're seeing that really high value in the middle of the night, the first thing we do want to look at is kind of what and when you ate the night before. Yeah. A lot of times people will eat these kind of later dinners, and that tends to be their largest meal of the day. May not be your audience necessarily, but often we see our higher carbohydrate meals followed by maybe a dessert, and it's at 8, 9, 10 p.m. And just the natural circadian rhythm of our hormones, our insulin sensitivity also kind of differs at time of day, and it tends to be lowest at night. So the later the meal, the bigger the meal, and the heavier it is in carbohydrates. For some people, that might mean a delayed and more dramatic glucose response in the middle of the night. So that's typically the first thing we're going to look at that in that situation. But if the meal timing looks good, if the meal content looks good, the next thing we're really going to dig into is the stress. Because again, that's the most common explanation for that really high or really fluctuating glucose values while you're sleeping. And that's that cortisol surge. So typically some stress management techniques are really digging into what that source of stress is, can help even out those nighttime glucose values. So those are really the two big areas we want to look at. And for some people, it might just be physical activity, kind of when we're sedentary, our skeletal muscles are an important glucose regulator. So if you're not doing a lot of strength training, if you're not very physically active, again, probably not the core problem for your audience, but for a lot of people, kind of increasing that physical activity can also help even out those glucose values at night.
Great points. And I think I forget what book it was, Dr. Sachin, or who's the one that did the circadian rhythm of all your organs, Sachin Panda.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of looks at yourself, your best time of day to eat, like when you are able to have more insulin sensitivity and when to exercise, and all of that is such a fascinating research to look at and correlate that with planning your ideal day. When is it ideal day for me to do low heart rate yoga, meditation, when to do a hard workout, to do strength training, and really map out your day. But also, Mindy Pels and I did a podcast on mapping your cycle is her thing, but then it's like, all right, let's take it to the next level for the athlete and female athlete, what workouts are best to do and how to eat based on your cycle too. It's really fascinating how rabbit hole you can get down.
That's true.
But yeah, I think key thing for sleep and stress is I always find not eating before bed, like 3 hours before bed. So if you're going to bed at 10, stop eating any calories after 7 p.m. And that's what I found my body. I don't have children and a family to feed. It's just my husband and I. And thanks to COVID working remote, since our new lifestyle changed our jobs that we work at home, that we eat our lunch at 2:00. And so I don't eat anymore after that. I'll have some essential aminos after my strength workout, but it is, experimenting with, all right, what can I eat that won't impact my sleep? Looking at my Aura score and looking at my NutriSense to see what makes my glucose more steady. But it's, all these different metrics is so interesting to really personalize our health and wellness program.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, the 3 hours is a really good place to start if you're not sure. Works for most people, but some people are more sensitive to it, might need to bump it a little earlier. But trying to avoid that food 3 hours before bed is a really good rule of thumb.
And also I found I can't eat a high protein meal before bed. And that was more for my Aura ring, but my sleep was horrible. And then I was just listening to a study today, podcast seminar on your body temperature goes up, after you have protein. So because you're burning more calories, breaking that down, and how that increases your body temperature while you're sleeping. So it's also like what you eat, when you eat, why, how, and all this information we can get to really figure out what it is. So I think we answered this question, but one question from one of our listeners: I've been wearing CGM for 2 months and love it. I'm trying to find sources of good fuel for long rides and runs. I tried a few foods before as gluten-free bread with almond butter, which spiked their glucose over 70 points. I'd love to know, one, higher glucose spikes, are they more acceptable during endurance events? To kind of answer this. And number two, are those high spikes followed by steep ones that drops? Are that like going high and then dropping really low? I think is what she's asking. Is that bad? So if we have like the big, huge spikes like that, is that bad for us? Any suggestions for foods to fuel would be great. Well, that would be experimenting, but so going back to figure out what foods to eat.
Yeah. And just to recap, she's seeing the high spike and the dip during the workout, or it's with the meal?
Good question. During. So are higher spikes more acceptable during endurance events, which I would think not. You're not going to, if your heart rate's down, depends what your heart rate is. If it's fat burning type of heart rate range versus anaerobic, like a race pace.
Yeah. Yep. Just like you said, typically, with the kind of, again, supply and demand, thinking about it in that lens, if we're having that high spike during kind of a steady state cardio, that might be a little unusual. I don't know if she's talking about then she's having a higher carbohydrate meal during and seeing that high spike and drop. That might be, we're overdoing it a little bit. Might want to tweak kind of the content of that meal, but typically don't see a big spike during kind of steady state cardio. That was
her question, was more figuring out what foods to eat before workout. And that's what, people can do. You can, or Vitargo, they're both a slow release carbohydrate drink.
Yeah.
I know, she said gluten-free bread, but again, it's so interesting. And I test like Vibrant Wellness Zoomers on people. And this is something else I didn't get to talking about, but just food sensitivities, how your blood sugar will go up. Like I had a corn, when I first started using CGM, moving to San Diego, we had tacos for my first time, really real tacos in the corn. I can't do corn. And I did a food Zoomer. I'm very highly reactive to corn, sadly, but how your glucose will go up if you're reactive to food. So maybe it's something in a gluten-free bread. There's I was reading ingredients again at that natural product show, and there's not very many breads that are good quality, except for one that is $20 a loaf I found. But, I think spiking your glucose up, that would be going back to doing a carb tolerance test, as Rob Wolf talks about in his book, Wired to Eat, and then figuring out that N=1 experiment. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And it's going to require, some experimentation of kind of find that right food. I do see a lot of people have success with kind of, if you want to go more of a fruit route, small banana, unsweetened applesauce. Both of those are kind of worth experimenting with. The honey, like you mentioned, but it is definitely variable and requires some experimentation there.
Yeah, I know I get a headache from a lot of fruit. So I know, I think I'm probably fructose sensitive. So I didn't know that was a thing. I just read that. It's like, oh, that's probably what I have. But I think it's people afraid of having any spikes. So it is, just to summarize, when is it appropriate to have a spike in your glucose? But there's like the Goldilocks effect, not too high, not too low, just the right amount is going to be normal as an athlete, depending on the heart rate, intensity of the workout, and duration, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it is normal to see some glucose fluctuate. If you're not eating at all, again, it's normal to see it if you're having that higher intensity. So typically above 70% VO2 max is when we start to see most higher glucose responses to workouts. And it's also normal to see your glucose rise if you're eating carbohydrates or if you're eating a large meal, even if it doesn't have carbohydrates in it. That's normal and expected. But again, we don't want to see it go too high, and we want to see it kind of be able to return back to normal after 2 to 3 hours. So a flatline glucose is not necessarily the goal. Some people don't ever really see fluctuations, and that's okay too, but it doesn't necessarily mean that healthy fluctuations are any better than completely flat glucose.
Would that go to the thing everyone keeps going to now is that variability. Like we've talked for years about heart rate variability, but now it's, metabolic variability, flexibility. So being metabolically flexible, that you're not in strict nutritional ketosis. You should have perhaps some athletes to do better on a higher carb, non-nutritional ketosis day, and mix it up as we do with our workouts. You should do some harder workouts and then go lower, easier restorative weeks. So I wonder if that's, something, for those people that have, like my clients, glucose might go up and down just like 5 beats every day. It's like so steady. Maybe that's not ideal. Maybe he wants to have some days that he has his spikes go up and come back down.
Yeah. And I truly believe that some variability, like you're mentioning, is actually ideal. And that's kind of the concept of the metabolic flexibility. I like to describe it as almost like a hybrid car. A hybrid car knows how to use which fuel when is best, right? Sometimes you need gasoline if you're accelerating quickly, but sometimes you can just use the kind of electric engine if you're just coasting. It's kind of similar with glucose versus fat. And we want to be able to utilize both of those energy systems depending on the environment. And that's the idea of really being metabolically flexible. And I do see that sometimes when people have, no carbohydrates in their diet for many, many, many years, and their glucose never fluctuates, that if they do then need that higher energy, or they do try to incorporate carbohydrates back in, that system, that, more glucose prime system isn't as trained anymore. Just like your standard American is very used to using glucose as energy, but they haven't trained that fat system at all. Typically for the average person, that's the area we need to work on, but sometimes we can go too extreme on the other end too. And we might need to relearn how to use glucose as a fuel system as well. So I think it's perfectly healthy to have some of that variability and have that innate ability to kind of adapt to your environment and use whichever system is most optimal for the situation.
I agree with that. I mean, I feel that, we need to wrap this up. So I keep talking about this topic for hours, because I think it's just so packed with information, what you can get from a CGM for athletes, and for people that are like me, that type A driven, ambitious overachiever in my past life, that I was doing all these right things and I created complete metabolic chaos in my body. So when I hit my adrenal exhaustion in 2013, I was doing fasted workouts. I was doing low carb keto before it was such a big trend as it is now. So I was doing all this back in 2005 and fasting before Ironman training, really long workouts. And I was training 20 hours a week. And so you think you're fit and healthy. And that's kind of why I do what I do now, is train athletes to be fit and healthy from the inside out. Less is more. And it's finding that amount of everything for you, the individual, that is required for you to be your best self, live your best life, and look at performance gains, but longevity, looking at what you're doing now to improve your future self. So I thank you for sharing so much information today and helping our athletes figure out how they can really dial in their nutrition and exercise and help get that information. Because I know it's helped my clients tremendously, just having that on every day and just really learning what's going on with their body.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Hopefully it's helpful for some people out there.
Yeah. And people can go to NutriSense. The website is,
NutriSense.io.
I
If you
always
go
do
to
it wrong.
.com though, it will redirect you there now. So
Yeah. Every time I look it up, it's like, wait, not that. It's .io, NutriSense.io. And then you guys can save money on your NutriSense with our code Low Carb Athletes. So we'll put all that in the show notes. And thanks again for sharing your time with us and all of your knowledge, and congratulations on such a successful first couple years plus on your business.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.